Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on the framework guidelines and scenarios for network planning. I still see people dropping in, so maybe give just a minute, somebody else will join. But in the meanwhile, we can maybe start with just the introductory part. So first of all, this webinar will be recorded, so you should all be fine with that, especially the ones asking any questions or commenting in any other way. And of course, this recording will be made available on the event page. So will, of course, the presentations. For any questions you might have during or after the presentations, you can use Slido. You'll have the details on that in the next slide. But in general, of course, your microphones will be muted, and I can then maybe invite you for any oral interventions in case there would need to be an additional explanation or clarification of the questions you may ask. So here you have the Slido instructions. Probably the easiest thing is to just scan the QR code. I'll leave this slide on for a bit. But I guess the majority of us already know how to use Slido. In general, we'll have a couple of presentations starting by our colleagues from the Commission, followed by ACER and then the ENSOs. So maybe best not to lose too much time. I will directly hand over to Maciej from DG Ener. Maciej, please.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me and you can see me. Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to start the webinar and to make a short introduction. I think I can move to the next slide, which is on the agenda, and then move directly to my presentation, which sets the scene a bit for this framework guidelines that are going to be discussed and presented today. For us, it's an important deliverable in the context of the revised 10E regulation, which emphasizes the role of the scenarios in the assessment of the projects. And this is going to be the main emphasis of my presentation, where I'm going to set the scene for the revision of the 10E, what comes with it, and how this deliverable framework guidelines fit into the work under the new legal framework. So starting with the 10E revision, the context for it was the European Green Deal communication and the objectives for the climate neutrality. There are new climate and energy targets for 2030 and 2030, and with the Fit for 55 package, then the energy infrastructure was a key component to reach those targets. So hence this revision. Broadly, the evaluation of the previous regulation showed that the regulation was fit for purpose, but there was a need for some adjustments, taking into account the new contexts, and the emphasis was again about the market integration, security of supply, and competitiveness. So this revision was started in the 2020, and the regulation entered into force in May 2022, so not so far ago. So what were the main changes coming? The new rules for cross-border planning of the energy infrastructure. As indicated, the main purpose was a full alignment of infrastructure with the European Green Deal. What comes with it? There are new and updated infrastructure categories and reconfiguration of priority corridors and thematic areas. Now hydrogen is there. Electrolyzers also have been added, but there is no scope for natural gas projects. There are also dedicated offshore planning provisions, taking into account that there is going to be increasing role of the offshore wind in the power generation. Also strengthen cross-border energy infrastructure planning and governance, and this is the key aspect of the presentation, key topic of the presentation, where the framework guidelines will fit perfectly. And another big change is accelerated permitting and increased transparency. There is more focus about the stakeholder involvement, stakeholder consultation. Permitting is still an outstanding issue, so there is still an effort to do it better and coordinate it better. And there is a new category of project of mutual interests, which are the projects with the third countries. So these are in a nutshell the main changes. And going to the core of what is interesting in our discussion today is the strengthened EU planning governance process. So the idea behind this was to optimize and coordinate cross-border, cross-sectoral infrastructure planning on the basis of scenarios that are developed by the ENSOs. And those scenarios should be fully in line with the latest EU decarbonization targets and energy targets, and also the Commission scenarios to the extent possible. And also, what is required is the application of the energy efficiency first principle throughout the TUINDP development process. So at various stages of the development of the TUINDP, so it's needs identification, scenario construction, and also when selecting later on PCI, assessing PCI and PMI projects. There's also the emphasis on strengthened consultations with member states, also with stakeholders, and also the Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change that gives opinion on various deliverables throughout the process during the preparation of the scenarios, the identification of infrastructure gaps, and also methodologies for cost-benefit analysis. Because we have now new project categories, not all of them are covered by the CBA methodologies developed by ENSOs. There is a need for consistency between the ENSOs developed CBA methodologies and methodologies, let's call it outside the TUINDP framework, such as electricity storage, which is not necessarily to stay under the ENSO's remit for the timing. It is the case, but according to the new law, it can also be an independent category for the CPA, if we call it like independent. And for other categories of project like hydrogen, electrolyzers, smart gas grids, and CO2 networks, there are dedicated CBA methodologies being developed, and there was a series of consultations that finished in January, precisely on those methodologies that would have to be developed in the near future. There is also then oversight from the Commission on the main inputs to the TUINDPs and stronger role of ACER. So the Commission approves the scenarios and the CBA methodology. There's also a new deliverable, which is the ACER framework guidelines, which is precisely the topic of today's discussion. And ACER also gives opinion on scenarios and CBA. And lastly, there is the new governance ensures coordination in long-term planning and development of offshore and onshore electricity grids. There is big emphasis. There is a new chapter on offshore development and planning. So this is a slide presenting basically the structure of what I have just presented. So there are various inputs to the TUINDPs, which are the basis then for the assessment of the PCIs. There are scenarios, infrastructure gap identification, cost-benefit analysis, and as you can see now, the Commission and ACER has a stronger role in giving the opinion and contributing to those deliverables. And ACER framework guidelines fit perfectly in this. They would help develop the scenarios in the way that is needed for the assessment of the PMIs and a consistent approach for the TUINDPs. They are not only used for this purpose, but also serve as a basis for the infrastructure gap identification and CBAs. So indeed, the role of scenarios is quite important. Also, the role of the framework guidelines. So moving to the next slide, on the framework guidelines specifically, they should help ensure development of robust scenarios in line with the EU targets and involve wide range of stakeholders. So this is the main objective of this new deliverable. And there are specifically required under Article 12 of the 10E regulation. They were to be published 7 months following the entry into force of the regulation, and this is going to be precisely almost to date the case, as the regulation entered force in May. It is supposed to be supported with the extensive consultation, and we also know that this was the case. There was a series of webinars and also public consultation, and there is a provision that these guidelines can be updated regularly if needed. Hopefully there is no need, but there is the scope for adjustment and making it fit for purpose, taking into account the latest developments in the future or the new developments in the future. Importantly, this is the second deliverable under the 10E regulation after the onshore sea basin goals that were agreed from on 19th January. So big congratulations to ACER for this. This is yet another deliverable under 10E, and we are happy that we are going according to the schedule. So again, maybe more precisely on the requirement for the framework guidelines coming from the Article 12. They should establish criteria for transparent, non-discriminatory, and robust development of joint scenarios. As I indicated, scenarios play a key role for the development of the TUNDPs and also for the assessment of the PCIs and PMI candidates. So the role of framework guidelines will be critical to ensure that they are fit for purpose. They should also the guidelines should ensure that the scenarios are fully in line with the energy efficiency first principle, which is now very prominent in the regulation, taking into account the latest available commissioner scenarios and NECPs to the extent possible when they are available, because the NECPs have their own timing and they can be revised and updated in different timings, but it's still a very important basis and reference for the scenarios. And take into account the recommendations from member states, stakeholders, and specifically the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, which did provide its opinion on the framework guidelines. And the agency shall submit its opinion on compliance of the scenarios with the framework guidelines, including possible recommendations for amendments if needed. So this is the role of the framework guidelines in the process as prescribed in the regulation. So how it was the process of the development of the scenarios? It was quite complex. It was steered by ACER with the participation of the Commission. The process, I think, went quite smoothly, which again, I would like thank ACER very much for this. We were involved and contributed to the extent possible. For the future, the scenarios should be in line with the revised NE regulation, enabling adequate EU infrastructure planning, but hopefully also should enable a wider use of the TUNDP scenarios for project implementation, that is also as regards regulatory decision like CBCA or investment incentives. So the scenarios can play various roles, and we hope that framework guidelines would help make the scenarios more robust, more transparent, as indicated in the regulation. And with this introduction, I would like to once again thank ACER for this webinar, for the development of timing of the scenarios, and congratulations on the timely deliverable. And if there are any questions on this, I will be happy to take them later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maciej, and thanks to all DGNR colleagues for the very nice cooperation on this work. I'm handing now to Nico, who was leading the work on ACER side. Nico, please take control.
Thank you, Jan, and also thank you, Maciej, for setting the scene for this important work that we completed. We indeed were tasked with a very complex process, delivering these framework guidelines for the TUNDP scenarios. And it's complex because, of course, it needs to meet this important objective that Maciej elaborately explained. So this meeting of the European energy and climate policy objectives is crucial That's why the scenarios need to meet those objectives. They need to take into account the energy efficiency first principles. They need to take into account Commission scenarios and also national energy and climate plans. And all of that needs to be done in a challenging timeline of the biennial 10-year network development plans. So that's a very challenging task. So where could we find inspiration for this task? Of course, in the regulation itself. We also had our ACER opinions that we have produced on the previous scenarios that have been developed either separately or lately the joint scenario reports. So our own opinions provided inspiration, but then of course we also reached out to stakeholders. And as Maciej mentioned, we tried to do this extensive consultation with many representative organizations, first in the summer, in a series of workshops that we used to identify key topics and to find new ideas that we could introduce, and to also see what cannot be covered right now, but maybe has to wait until a later time, to also explain that there should be this focus in this first edition of the guidelines. We developed these ideas further and then did a public consultation with a good response rate, balanced replies from civil society organizations. We're very thankful for those inputs, because it's not always easy for us to reach those organizations. Of course, many DSO and TSO organizations participated, other market participants, but also research institutes or associations dealing with technology and innovation. And then lastly, also the Scientific Advisory Board provided extensive comments, very useful comments that we discussed with them to find out what needed to go into the guidelines, what would fit maybe in other deliverables, because 10E is of course more than just scenarios. But thanks to all those inputs, we managed to complete the task and to deliver basically on 5 key topics, criteria, to ensure this the timely process, to ensure that we have the robust objective-driven scenario, focusing on transparency, but also an inclusive and streamlined process. Also ensuring stakeholder scrutiny, so an enhanced role for stakeholders, and lastly, a quick update process. So I'll quickly go into each of these with a few highlights, but of course there is much more detail in the published guidelines, and I invite all of you, of course, to read those, and if you have questions, you can always reach out to us. So on the timeliness, as I mentioned, these scenarios need to fit into the TYNDP process, and that's produced every 2 years, so it needs to fit in that 2-year cycle. Now, as you can see on the timeline that I drafted just for illustration, I left it open-ended, because it would be very nice to define scenario development as a strict 1-year process, but of course that's not reality, just as that the completion of the TYNDP is also not the end of the process, because TYNDP then feeds into the PCI selection and some other assessments. But largely we believe that the scenarios should be delivered by the end of the year that precedes the publication of the TYNDP. So that means for TYNDP 2024, we would expect the scenarios at the end of the year 2023, as an example. So that's one thing, to have the timely delivery, but we also want to incorporate as recent as possible information. So that's the challenge that we need to meet, and that ENSO E and ENSO G need to meet. And to help with that, we focused also on having a process timeline, a very detailed process timeline, and also a stakeholder engagement plan, which I will discuss a bit more in the the chapter on transparency and then the inclusive development process. Then we have the actual development of the scenarios that need to be robust and first of all also objective driven. So that means that they need to meet the objectives set in the adopted union policies. We cannot go below that. We can also not go very much beyond those policies because they have been politically agreed, and these scenarios, the TYNDP scenarios, are not policy scenarios. They're scenarios to do assessments that should take into account the policies that have been decided. So to achieve this robustness, we focused on bottom-up development. That means that NECPs, the National Energy and Climate Plans, could be a very interesting starting point because those plans are developed at national level. They include the scrutiny at the national level, and that is true for most bottom-up data and assumptions. So we think that is a good principle to follow. At the same time, we also acknowledge that the set of scenarios should be focused. We cannot have 100 possible futures because it's difficult for policymakers to deal with that. And it's also very challenging for NSOE and NSOC to have the resources to commit to such a development. That's why we focus in the guidelines on this stable minimum set of scenarios, which includes the best estimate scenario that will be largely based on the NECPs, properly amending those assumptions that might be outdated. And of course, it's good to stress test this best estimate scenario with what we call a low economy and high economy storyline. This is to relate very well to decision makers. This is something they understand, and as decision makers will have to assess the projects. It's good that they can get the information in a format that is relatable to them. Of course, that does not mean that more scenarios cannot be constructed. That's entirely possible. We do require then that they are contrasting so that you always have the two sides of the possible future, because that's ensuring this robustness. The focus should also be on let's say, the first 15 years that are very important for network development. So from now until the next 10 to 15 years, we really need to have detailed scenarios, but we also require this perspective towards 2050, because of course the scenarios need to be checked against the objectives, and that's only possible if that viewpoint is developed. That brings me to the transparent, inclusive, and streamlined development process. What does that mean? An open process is what we want, so involving stakeholders and very broad participation. So one element of that is to have this timeline published at the start of the process, because that will be very helpful for anyone who wishes to engage on scenarios to participate in the process. And complementing that process timeline, there should be a stakeholder engagement plan that will describe not only the tasks and the time points where the stakeholder reference group would interact, but also where there is, for instance, the general public consultation when that would be planned. So, and I already mentioned then that we created or require the ANSOs to create a stakeholder reference group. And that is meant as a vehicle to bring stakeholders closer to the scenario preparation process, to involve them throughout the process. And I will, on the next slide, tell you what exactly we have in mind with that. It would, of course, be very useful if the stakeholders can provide also input to define that process timeline and to define that stakeholder engagement plan. As to the accessibility of information. Of course, we focus on the clear communication and the proper documentation so that the scenarios are transparent. And we found here this principle of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data and then documentation. That's a good principle to follow. But of course, we know that different stakeholders have different needs and capabilities. So for some stakeholders, they would like to have the close to raw data. So to the extent possible, these should be published for stakeholders. But then, of course, other stakeholders benefit more from a more visual approach with maybe nice graphs and charts to assess or to understand the scenario. So we request that the NSOE and NSOC find a way to accommodate these different needs, which to a large extent is already the case today. Then coming back to this role of the stakeholder reference group, we foresee enhanced stakeholder scrutiny. So to have this stakeholder reference group in a role as scrutinizers, advising NSOE and NSOC on the assumptions and the inputs that underpin the scenarios that are being developed. This way, we want to allow a multilateral discussion among stakeholders, whereas so far we noticed that most stakeholder engagement was in a bilateral way. So you could communicate with NSOE and NSOC, but stakeholders would not necessarily discuss among each other. So to have those contrasting views in one place, we believe that the stakeholder reference group could bring new ideas and could improve in the end the acceptance of the scenarios. At the same time, I should clearly point out that it's a non-binding advice and the NSOs will remain the sole owners of the scenarios development process. So they are responsible to deliver the scenarios, and of course any advice on the assumptions will be public, and NSOs will explain why they took on board some aspects or why not. But it's clear that they remain the sole owners of the process. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we wanted this timely process fitting in the 2-year cycle. At the same time, we also want to take into account the most relevant information. And of course, not everything is predictable, or sometimes it's very difficult to wait for certain data. The process needs to run its way. But to make sure that relevant information can be taken into account to make sure that the scenarios are fully compliant with the requirements and that they're relevant for the assessments that will lead to decisions. We foresee this process by which the assumptions can be reviewed and updated if necessary, at least for this central best estimate scenario, but also for the variance if there is time. Whereas stakeholders, NSOE, NSOG, but also, for instance, the Scientific Advisory Board can notify the occurrence of a significant event and can request the quick update process. The activation shall be done by the Commission or ACER. So all these features, they fit together. And we hope with this that indeed we can ensure a scenario development process that is more transparent, that has more robustness, and is also non-discriminatory, so to really be inclusive. It's the first edition of these guidelines, and as Maciej pointed out, they shall be updated as seen fit. So this is also for us a learning process. I imagine that's the same for NSOE and NSOC, so we will keep an eye on this. If needed, we will update them. That's what I had to say for now. So thank you for giving me this time, and I hand over to Jan.
Thank you very much, Nico. For us not to lose too much time, I propose we go directly to the ENSOs. I'm not sure who of the ENSOs would start first. You have the joint presentations. Alan, right? Okay, you just take control and present. And then Alexander, I also see you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I was able to take control, but now it's I lost it. So I don't know if you can go to the first slide.
Maybe Alexander, can then you take control because you will probably start next.
Yes, I can try. Yep,
Okay,
I have
then,
control.
Perfect, then you do it. Thank you very much.
Now I see it back again. Thanks. Somewhere, somehow. Thank you. Looking at the scenario framework guidelines and let's say this workshop, we're happy to be involved, let's say, in this stakeholder engagement process. And I think it's good to mention indeed that, let's say, in the last more than 10 years, we have already been working together with ENSO-G and ENSO-E, trying to achieve more and more what is also, let's say, being reflected now in the 10E. So many developments that are now in 10E, we have already been working on, and happy to see this back as such. And I think it's also good to recognize that the way we want to work together and deliver something is to have in our focus, let's say, to support decision making, how to reach objectives with a common scenario that works for the whole European Union, and also make sure that the quality of supply that we have currently in the European Union is maintained, because we are able to analyze it hour by hour on the whole energy scale, so also the interactions with the other sectors. To make this happen, the scenarios are very important on this one, and that means, but they're not the only part. So what I would like to show you is indeed how it interacts and picks up, because next to the scenarios, we also have the TYNDPs, which are, let's say, currently still separate processes within ENSO-E and ENSO-G. But what also is good to know, and looking at the framework guidelines, these things take time to bring everything together. So I would like to show that currently we're indeed with ENSO-G working on the TYNDP 2022. It's being finalized, let's say, mid this year, with ENSO-E also delivering the TYNDP 22, aiming, let's say, in Q2, having also our consultation, public consultation next week, Tuesday, on, let's say, our, let's say, last draft. So you're all happy to join us. But we already started a time ago with preparing the scenarios for the next cycle. The kickoff internally has been, let's say, in April, May, looking at the storyline development going on. So we're already busy with data collection and picking up scenario story build. That means that today we'll try to share with you how we are looking at implementing the framework guidelines, which process-wise should be at the start of a whole scenario part, but are now in the middle of our scenario process. What can we already do? What can we not pick up? And happy to do that with Alexander today, who is my colleague in ENSO-G, also steering the scenario building. If there are specific questions on TYNDP, there are also other colleagues present that can, let's say, answer during the panel different questions. So to recap a bit, the TYNDP 2024 has already kicked off. We already had, let's say, a workshop in July last year, using your feedback, sharing with you, let's say, the timeline, the scenario strategy, the details, trying to see, okay, how can we build upon and coming to, let's say, our next version. And we have also even improved and extended the way we're working with different sectors, because we have recognized that getting the scenarios properly done needs, let's say, further deep dives, which we have found that it would be very good to share and have bilateral meetings with specific sectors to understand how we can take those things into our process, in our modeling, to also accommodate those trends going forward. Looking at, let's say, this process in scenario building, we're also having, again, the next stakeholder engagement, where we'll have a webinar on February the 20th, where you all also are invited for, to look at where are we, what are still the possibilities, what are the possibilities to change, and how to pick up further. So please keep the event page on your radar and register if you are, let's say, interested in sharing your feedback or getting, let's say, to know what's happening. And then now more, how do we look at the framework guidelines as such? And I think, Alexander, please take over to share with what we think.
Okay, thanks, Alan. So I took control, and now we will look a bit more into detail what we can already adjust and what we can incorporate in the 2024 scenario cycle, and what elements of the framework guidelines unfortunately need to wait a bit for the 2026 scenario cycle. As Alan pointed out, we are in the middle of the 2024 scenario cycle, which means that in general, before we now look at some more detailed points, things stated in the framework guideline that should happen before starting of the scenario cycle. Of course, that's now a bit difficult to do as we're in the middle. However, we do our best to still accommodate and to incorporate these elements, maybe in a slightly different way, but still we try our best to factor that in. Now on the next 3 slides, we follow the structure of the framework guidelines document. So we have clustered this according to the chapters of the framework guidelines, starting with the timely scenario preparation process. On the left side, you will always see what we try to implement for the 20 side. You see what we then can do for the 2026 scenario cycle. So starting with the timely scenario preparation process, we can incorporate the NECPs to the extent possible. So we are already, as you could see on the previous slide or 2 slides ago, we already did work on a data collection. We already asked our members to provide us data in line with the upcoming NECPs. To be honest, some countries are advanced, so we hear from some countries that our first draft of NECPs are available. Some other countries, it's more blurry, but still we try our best to include this. We have started the review of the storylines, and we will we start working on a first draft of this living roadmap. Furthermore, we can give an intermediate update to all parties involved about the innovations to be implemented in the 2024 cycle. We worked a lot on the innovations, so what should we introduce, what new elements, where we can improve. We had quite a long list of topics. We are currently testing if it works, if we have the data, if the model works, etc., etc. So that's something where we are at the point soon where we can say, okay, these innovations are working for the 2024 cycle, and other innovations then unfortunately need to wait for the 2026 cycle. Then looking at the 2026 cycle, what we can do, of course, and will do together with the stakeholder reference group, with ACER and with the Commission, is to discuss and agree on a cutoff date for the adoption of new policies at the start of the scenario cycle. This is an element that can be quite useful, avoiding discussions very late in the process. Why do we factor in, or why we don't factor in new updated policies, strategies published? Because as you can imagine, the scenario process takes 2 years, almost 2 years. And if there's something coming on the very last day, it's almost impossible for us to incorporate this. But to have an agreement on that before is quite useful also for the process. What we will do at the beginning of the scenario preparation process is also looking at our storylines again, together with the stakeholders, to see if these storylines are still fitting, and if we need to update them. What we also can do for the 2026 cycle is to prepare then the living roadmap document where we will lay out what we plan to incorporate regarding innovations. This is a bit kind of, like a roadmap, because we do have a lot of ideas of innovation, but we also need to test them. So we cannot guarantee at the beginning of every scenario process that all the innovations we planned to incorporate will actually work. To give you just a simple example, is we are thinking about a finer geographical resolution on our scenarios, just as an idea. Why not try to break down the countries into zones? Whatever split we will do or whatever split we applied, we were not that far. We looked at this topic. We have figured out that it will be challenging data set wise, it will be challenging modeling wise. So that's something that we had to postpone from 2024 scenario cycle to the 2026 scenario cycle. And at the start of the 2026 cycle, and then every other scenario cycle that follows, we will then clearly communicate on the innovations, at least what we plan to do. The testing, of course, needs to be happen then during this scenario cycle. Now we are looking at the chapter, the criteria for robust objective-driven scenarios. What we can do for this cycle already is we can give a snapshot of the 2035 scenario time horizon. This is important to emphasize. It will be a snapshot. We have planned and set up our process, our data collection, etc., for the time horizons 2030, 40, and 50. So 2035, as requested by the framework guidelines, is something we will try to comply with, but it's something that we cannot go to the full extent. Then we will engage with the stakeholder reference group, and we will start the discussion how to expand the scenarios to take into account the low economic, high economic variant, given that in previous discussions over the last couple of years, it was never selected as a primary driver. So we're looking rather at centralization versus decentralization, at other main drivers, but that's something we have to discuss with the SRG, also to see how to incorporate this element in our scenario building process. And we will explain major differences on the inputs used in the ERA process on ENSO-E side and the scenario building process performed by NSOC and ENSO-E. For the 2026 cycle, we can factor in more of the elements, so we can really go for all elements. We will look at how regional differences are taken into account, for example, regarding commodity prices. We will provide a qualitative risk assessment. So we will highlight what are major uncertainties that our scenarios face and what this means for our scenarios, what could be the consequences. And linked to the high and low economic variant, we will work on implementing this as a stress test for the central scenario. Together, it's not written here, but this will of course be in close cooperation with the SRG. Based on the discussion, we hopefully will have already early mid this year. Then coming to the last chapter with the criteria for transparent, inclusive, and streamlined development process. So soon, within the next 3 months, we will start creating the stakeholder reference group. I think it will take a bit of time also to, Nico pointed this out, to see what are the expectations of all the stakeholder, what are the resources for the stakeholder. I see in the framework guidelines also the SRGs should nominate a convener. I think it will take a bit of time to get this up and running. Nevertheless, we will start quite soon with this process. And then for the 2026 scenario cycle, then we get at the very beginning of the scenario cycle, we can publish then a process timeline. We can publish a stakeholder engagement plan. Everything we have then set in a good plan in discussion with the SRG. So this was in really like a few minutes on a more detailed level what we plan to incorporate already now. As I said in the beginning, some elements are simply not feasible to incorporate completely for the 2024 cycle because they should be carried out at the beginning of the scenario process, but we still do our best to do some kind of intermediate update, intermediate information and inclusion of stakeholder. And then for the 2026 cycle, then we can incorporate all the elements outlined here to the full extent. That's it from the ENSO side. I think I hand over back to Jan.
Thank you, Alexander, and thanks, Alan. Very clear, and thank you all presenters. We are very much on time. I think actually we're a couple of minutes ahead of time or ahead of schedule. So I propose we go straight to the Q&A. We have a couple of questions in the Slido. There are also some sort of, let's say, more general comments than questions, but I would first jump to the questions. And I think maybe the first one is a question which is quite relevant. It's quite sort of up to date, but maybe in need of explanation, especially maybe here looking at NSOC colleagues, because it's mentioning LNG terminals. So we see that the TENI provides a set of rules for developing new infrastructures, and the process is quite lengthy, but yet quite a lot of new infrastructure, particularly LNG terminals and the connections to the networks, are being developed very fast in this stage. Yeah, is this development happening outside of the TYNDP? Please. Maybe Alexander, you answer the question.
Yes. So I can maybe answer the question for Germany, because that's where I follow it a bit more closely. So the process was indeed happening out there, the TYNDP, and for the first floating unit coming to Germany, it was even outside the network development plan. So usually you have the national network development plan where you get approval by the regulator. Okay, these pipelines are really needed, new connections, you get approval, and then you start the process of getting the permission, etc., etc. At least for the first floating unit, I know that there was a strong political will to have this floating unit as fast as possible connected to the grid. So the permission were granted a fast track procedure, and it was also exempted from the National Development Plan. But I think this is a really particular special case where it just needed to happen as fast as possible.
Thanks, Alexander. Maybe also to note that the TYNDP, meaning the EU-wide TYNDP, is not a binding plan. And usually, what we hope to have is first any new infrastructure to be included in the national plans, of course, to the extent possible, and only once it's in the national plans to then also be included in the TYNDP, because otherwise it could create some issues in the process later on. So I hope this has answered Katja's question. Maybe, even though we discussed internally not to touch upon this too much, but I think maybe it is a bit relevant, Nico, because there are some comments on the objectives of the scenarios and how, because we have set this objective-driven scenarios, and we explained that we have a framework within which the scenarios need to be developed. They need to respect the targets set by the policies, and this is sort of showing the way. And here there is sort of a comment on how these scenarios, commission scenarios, it's not really commission scenarios, it's how these sort of target-oriented scenarios are then aligned with stakeholder expectations. So maybe Nico, if you can briefly explain that.
Thank you, Jan. I'll do my best to provide some observations on this. So the TYNDP scenarios that need to follow the framework guidelines, they need to align with the commission scenarios. So these commission scenarios exist, but they are more at the policy level. And of course, these TYNDP scenarios have a very specific purpose. It's to do the assessment of proposed network infrastructure. So they do not try to set ambition levels, but they should rather comply with the ambition level. And the ambition level is set by the policies. Is that the best way to do it, or what is it, the realism of those scenarios? Well, if this is what member states have agreed to do in a policy, then that should give guidance to the network developers, to NSOE and NSOG on what kind of future they should look at, and then to develop the infrastructure that will enable that future that reaches those ambitions. So that would be my observations on this. Would be interesting to see if any of the other panelists have some views on that.
Maciej, please.
Yes, thank you. I think we have to take into account that what is the objectives of the 10E regulation regarding the scenarios and TUNDP, and they need to help assess the PCIs, the projects, the infrastructure that is needed to the achievement of the targets. So this is there has to be alignment. We have to assess the scenarios that are on the pathway to reach the targets, and we have to be committed to reach those targets. So it's not much about the realism, but the scenarios that are consistent with our ambition and the targets. So there are other policies that lead to the achievement of those targets, and energy infrastructure has to be one of the elements that leads to this. So in this respect, we have to assess the projects that would in the context of the scenarios that are aligned. So one can question from the perspective of the time at this moment that the scenarios that reach the targets might not look realistic, but we have to make them reality, or we have to assess the projects in the context that this is happening. Otherwise, we would have the exercise that we would set the projects that are not in line with the objective. So there is this probably the dilemma how you use the scenarios, how you look at the scenarios, and for what purpose. But from the perspective of the legislation, the legislation which has to be in line with the European Green Deal, the idea is that we look at the scenarios that are in line with the Commission ambition, and we assess the projects that are well, aligned with those scenarios from this perspective. So this is the objective of this exercise from our view. And maybe also on this short term and long term, this is the plan. These are the scenarios we'll never take into account. It's impossible actually to factor in all the latest developments, but we have to look at long term. It takes a lot of time for the infrastructure to be developed. We cannot predict everything. So of course the Repower EU was sort of an emergency response to the current crisis, and there are other projects identified outside of the scope of the long-term TUNDP planning, but there is, I think, no contradiction. We have to be flexible and also adjust to the new situations once it arrives.
Thank you very much, both. Do we have any other panelists who want to touch upon this? If not, I think maybe also to try to put my thoughts into this. Of course, the framework is set by the policies as has been discussed and explained, but within this framework there is some room, and that's why we propose this stakeholder reference group to work together with the ENSO, sort of to bring the knowledge of different sides together and discuss how to set these scenarios within those frameworks. So I think that is hopefully also answering the questions on how the balance of stakeholders' ambitions and the policy ambitions will be taken into account. Maybe the next question would be for Alan, because you explained on one of the slides that you reached out to different sectors, and the question is, does this mean different industries and other customer groups? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and maybe also a bit in correlation with the previous question. What we indeed try to do in the scenarios is to look at the policies which sets the objectives and how to make it work with, let's say, a view from the infrastructure. So we try to go back to hour by hour matching, let's say, the energy part. And this interaction between the different generators, users, and other parties like storages which will pop are the parts that indeed create this flexibility in how to build a scenario. And this is where indeed during the, let's say, cycle on cycle of TYNDP, where, like I said, we're already busy with more than 10 years. We are also developing our modeling experience and recognizing that other sectors are becoming more and more, let's say, important in the modeling because their impact is increasing drastically on, let's say, our infrastructure. We should realize that a lot of infrastructure, or let's say users of energy, were outside the electricity or the gas, and we're using oil or let's say fuels or those kind of things. And a lot is getting now into this electricity and gas infrastructure system. And that's why we indeed reach out to, for example, the heat sector, where you have the discussion on whether you're going to supply it by gas or by heat pumps. We reach out to the transport sector. How do they see the use of indeed fueling the electric cars with either hydrogen or let's say electricity, and what kind of profiles do they expect? And all those kind of things is what we're trying to reach out. Also, a very important one is with the DSOs. DSOs used to be, let's say, off-takers of the high voltage grid. ENSO-E is, let's say, taking into account the TSOs with the high voltage grids. But the interaction back from the regional distribution system operators is also now influencing our grids. So also this has been, for example, a very important stakeholder that we reach out. And like I said, let's say I also responded on Slido directly. We do have, let's say, a log where all the meetings with the different stakeholders have been, let's say, noted and are publicly available to also create transparency that we all also, let's say, would like to achieve in the whole scenario process. So people can realize, is their interest being taken care of, or who they try to, let's say, give input, etc.
Thank you very much, Alan. Maybe one more sort of technical question. How do you take into account price response of residential consumers? Do you have a rebound effect? What about industrial demand destruction? Is there a re-industrialization or a rebasing of industrial demand on low levels, Alan?
Yeah, we take different approaches, but this is indeed one of, let's say, where we're also trying to look in the future. And we definitely don't know for sure Well, we have increased the flexibility response as such. So demand side response has increased in the years how this would act. We have also looked indeed at what kind of industries would be there or not. So kind of growth rates of this, using also the external sources from, for example, the European Commission's own scenarios. Because, like was already mentioned, we're trying to figure out what is the impact on the infrastructure given the objectives that the European Commission has. So trying to keep that alignment. So the ANSOs will not certainly come up with a complete new industry perspective for Europe. We follow, let's say, what's, let's say, in the European Commission, or we try to, let's say, translate it. What kind of behavior, where would it be, how would it pick up, given, let's say, the different input, the different analysis, different studies that are there, and trying to make it a coherent set of scenarios for whole Europe, because that's also maybe good to emphasize. We're working together with many countries, which all have their national, let's say, views, and the ANSOs are making it one view. This is, let's say, unheard of in the world, the way we bring things together. And also as being member of, let's say, one national TSO in my daily job, we also rely heavily for our national analysis, what the ANSOs have delivered for whole Europe, because we have one energy market within Europe. So the interaction between the different countries is very big. And that's where, let's say, we kind of emphasize each other in making our analysis better and better.
Thank you, Alan, very much. Nico, there is a question for you on the participation of the stakeholder reference group and what are the criteria to become a member?
Thank you, Jan. Well, the SRG will for sure include the list of stakeholders directly mentioned in the regulation. We call them the key stakeholders. So those should definitely be invited, but we encourage, of course, that this SRG is open to other stakeholders that may have particular expertise or interest. And a call for interest should be launched by the ANSOs. And then, of course, organizations can apply. We do recommend, of course, to have a balanced composition and that the same interest group is represented by one organization, ideally, so that in the end we have a balanced discussion in that group. I'm sure that Alexander or Alan could maybe say a few more words on that, on how they plan to do that. But I would firstly like to acknowledge that this challenge of the timelines for the 2024 scenarios, and that it's indeed great to launch the SRG early on, to involve them as much as possible to the current process, but also to make them aware how this process works, to let them learn so that they will be ready and can contribute proactively towards the 2026 scenarios. But so in short, the invitation is quite open to all organizations. But of course, the membership itself, we would like to see a balanced composition in the end.
Thank you, Nico. I don't see too many other questions. There is one sort of a comment which again sort of relates to the variance of scenarios and whether it would be more fitting to consider extreme operational conditions. But I think once again, these scenarios are sort of to assess the value of future networks, future grid developments, and looking at extremes. If something is an extreme, this does not happen very often, so it doesn't make too much sense to base an economic or techno-economic decision on an extreme event. But of course, I think resilience, grid resilience and things like that, I know that this is assessed. This is one of the indicators later on being done through the cost-benefit assessment methodologies. So I think, you know, grid resilience is becoming more and more important and is being reflected in the work of the ENSOs. I'm looking again at Slido if I see anything else there. No, I don't see anything to touch upon right now.
Maybe Jan,
Go ahead, Alan.
I've seen some comments or questions being said about the balance that needs to be found in the scenario, and I think that's indeed a very fair point. Maybe to also elaborate a bit where we stand in involving, let's say, the stakeholders. We always try to look indeed, okay, what does it mean for the interests of a different group? Because the scenarios is a closed energy part. So if you choose for one, it impacts the other. And that's also indeed was mentioned, it should be a balanced stakeholder group, reference group. This is where we also would like to have that discussion. Okay, if this would, let's say, exceed and going further, that means another stakeholder needs to take, let's say, the impact of it. That there are communicating elements there. And this is indeed where we continuously try to have the open and fair discussion, what makes sense or not. And this is also when we ask for people engaging in the stakeholder reference group to also have, let's say, that kind of mindset that in the end, it should fit together. So it's not only about, okay, trying to look at this specific item. It's indeed trying to have this holistic view where we need to bring things in balance and pick it up. And this is where often the dilemmas are, let's say, rising. And this is where ENSO-E and ENSO-G are also very happy to get the stakeholder reference group opinion, because we're not the only experts here. We need to work with all the experts, and trying to reach and identify the dilemmas and find the solution forward is definitely what can help us all having, let's say, a realistic and useful scenario. So I really liked the, say, question or comments that scenarios is about finding a balance between different interests.
You're right, Alan, of course. And that's why we proposed to have the stakeholder reference group in. I think this is one of the biggest accomplishments, and I think I'm happy that we all agree. So the ENSOs, ACER and the Commission, and I expect also the vast majority of stakeholders agree that the inclusion of a stakeholder reference group is a good idea, and hopefully it will also prove itself as a good idea, which of course heavily depends on how active the stakeholders will be. Since there is no more questions, at least for now, maybe does anybody want to say something or feels that there was something missing and wants to contribute? Nico?
Yes, Jan, I wanted to pick up on one. It's not a new question, but it was a clarification on one of the questions, and it's about the energy efficiency. And there I want to add that, of course, the energy efficiency first principle needs to be followed. That's clear, that this is a requirement in the regulation. But at the same time, the energy efficiency assumption that will be taken on board is something that needs to be discussed exactly with the help of the stakeholder reference group. And it's again, as Alan was explaining, to find this balance of what it means, what is realistic, what is necessary to reach the ambitions, or the objectives. So I think we need to look at it in this light. Of course, we can miss on all the targets. We can make assumptions about offshore wind that would be there and it will not be there. If we think like that, everything can go wrong, of course. But we need to prepare and we need to make assumptions, and this needs to be done in a balanced way. Thank you.
Thanks, Nico. Maciej, please.
Yes, thank you. I think just to complement what Nico has just said, I think the main concern here is with the energy efficiency targets that we would plan for insufficient infrastructure. The framework is that we are constrained, or we say it constrained, but we have to reach the targets, and the assessment of the project is based on those targets. This would not exclude any additional infrastructure to be built or put in the national development plans. I'm not sure if we are in the situation that energy efficiency targets would really disqualify some projects at this stage, but I think this is the concern that has been raised quite some time ago. We also will be looking at it if there are some needs for some additional variants of the scenarios, and then again, this is something to be discussed by the stakeholder reference group. But in the end, what is important for us that when we assess the targets, we really try to reach the targets also for energy efficiency, and these are the commitments also from member states. So we hope that everybody is committed to reach them by all means, being the energy infrastructure, being the policy measures to promote energy efficiency, building renovations, and things like this. So we cannot just disqualify those targets.
Thank you very much. I see one last minute question, which I think I can answer on the consultations, I guess, to the scenario guidelines and what has been taken into account and what not. I think we will publish everything on our website if it's not already there. It will be done very quickly. So in any case, we were always trying to be with these guidelines. One of the main principles that we had in mind was to be very inclusive to all stakeholders, especially to the ones who are usually not that close to the process of developing scenarios in general, but otherwise have extensive knowledge and could be very helpful in providing inputs to scenario development. I hope that we succeeded to bring you closer to developing these scenario guidelines. I know it was difficult, and maybe some of you do not feel that you were close enough. If you believe so, please send us an email. In any case, our intention is to continue working on these guidelines. This is a product which has now been delivered for the first time. So it's a learning process, as Nico mentioned already, for all of us. We will definitely be trying to develop and to overcome any issues we see, either from ourselves or if it's pointed out by you, the stakeholders. Once again, I would very kindly ask you to look for the call for the creation of the stakeholder reference group, to join it, especially if you have the capacity to work in such a group of stakeholders, and to be as active as possible within that group. I think only through your help can we achieve the goal that we have set with the creation of the stakeholder reference group. I would also like to thank the ENSOs for all of the work, not just here with us on the stakeholder, on the scenario guidelines, but also before that, because they have done an excellent job, and they have been doing an excellent job for many years, despite the comments we had over many opinions in the past. Of course, opinions are intended to look at potential deficiencies and point the ways of further improvements. So they always seem a bit critical, but we always respected the work of the ENSOs. We know how much energy goes into developing something like that, and it's definitely not an easy task. Same goes, of course, to the Commission, to our colleagues at DG Ener, who are keeping a close eye on the entire process, and it's very difficult also for them to manage so many different tasks with this aim of the green transition, which is quite burdensome, especially nowadays with so many different things happening around us, which unfortunately is not good. With that, I would like to thank you for participating today, for listening to the presentations. I hope we clarified any open issues you might have had. If not, please feel free to reach out to us. Please also visit our website. We'll have many things uploaded there, so you will be able to read the responses to the consultations, to see the documents, to see also the slides that have been presented today. I'm sure that you can also always reach out to the ENSOs if you have any questions on the process. And please also look at their websites to follow not just the scenario development, but also the entire TUNDP process, of which, of course, the scenarios are an integral part. With that, I thank you. I think we are a bit ahead of schedule, but that's always good. And I wish all of you a very nice day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.